When Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek: The Next Generation in 1987, he reinvigorated his vision of the future, and in doing so, he empowered a pop culture phenomenon that continues to grow and inspire even to this day.
The Roddenberry Archive has been doing a lot of amazing things. They've been building starships, they've been building bridges.
We're working very carefully to let people explore the various range of ships called Enterprise.
We've actually built digitally all of the bridges for the Starship Enterprise, and those are digitally in-universe versions. And we have them now as sort of this large interactive experience where you can literally go through the timeline of Star Trek.
We're very excited to be able to present these ships and their bridges to enjoy and explore. At the moment, we are concentrating on the Enterprise 1701D.
We are focused on thinking about the end of the TNG era, right? We have Picard Season 3. Those 10 episodes, I think, represent the end of a long chapter in Star Trek history. And they brought us in to scan a very special set, which of course is the Enterprise D, which was lovingly recreated physically by Dave Blass's team and the incredible production work. It speaks for itself.
I think you can't have a proper Star Trek Next Generation reunion without the Enterprise. As we constructed the story, I just love the idea of the last 2 episodes being this final reunion aboard that ship. And it seemed like we were never gonna pull it off. But if we could do it, maybe it would be one of the great moments in Star Trek.
For Season 3, it had actually been brought up early on that there was going to be a flashback on the D, and we started researching what exists. And then you ask that question, and when you get the nothing, you're like, well, that can't be. And then when it became a bigger thing that we were going to do the whole bridge of the Enterprise D, we started looking at some of these pieces that had been done, the replicas and the touring shows, and it was like, wow, that's just completely not accurate, and we need to start from scratch. It's going to be a museum quality replica. I have Patrick Stewart going to walk onto the set. I want him to feel like he was transported back in time. And then we just went through every single episode to find every detail. I was able to bring Herman Zimmerman, and he had no idea what he was coming to see. I said, you know, in order for me to design the future, I have to look at what was done in the past. And then we walked into the thing, and just watching him go, oh my God, this is exactly how it was. And to see people transported back to a time in their life that was so important to them, that was the moment for me. But if we didn't get it right, why bother doing it?
But the scans from the production are still real-world scans. Like, those are things where you can see plywood and you can see the screws and all that. But when people visit the in-universe Enterprise D, you're going to see all that removed. You're going to have things that are actually working. That is how the archive's always approached taking things from the production world, documenting them, scanning them, archiving them, even rebuilding them if they're not available physically for us to bring in.
There's tons of people whose first exposure to the Enterprise lore was being on the Enterprise D.
The Enterprise D is home to so many people. It's kind of this generation's Star Trek, and the artists recreating these sets have taken that to heart as well.
It's hard to realize that it's been decades since we did Encounter at Farpoint. And so now we have a generation of fans who grew up with Star Trek: The Next Generation. And that ship and those designs mean as much to them as Matt Jeffrey's work meant to Denise and I. And so we feel a real responsibility to help them get it as right as they can. To see the ship through their eyes, to be able to walk through virtually sets that I haven't personally been on in 3 decades is a real gift.
We have several excellent artists working on the project, and specifically on the Next Generation stuff. We have Tadeo De Oria.
The Enterprise D was my childhood Enterprise. It was always the place I wanted to be. It had those curved lines, and it had an almost organic feel, so it was an inviting place to me. Still to this day remains very unique, drastically different from any Enterprise that came before it. Especially during the movies, the Enterprise started looking more and more militaristic, and Gene Roddenberry wasn't involved in the movies. So when he got the chance to create TNG, he, along with Andy Probert, decided to take the Enterprise back to what his vision was. It doesn't look at all like a battleship, but I think that's a statement from Roddenberry about what his idea for Star Trek was.
The Enterprise D is incredibly special because it really was, in some respects, the last bridge that Gene Roddenberry was alive for and brought to fruition.
Looking back, Star Trek: The Next Generation was a pivotal moment in Star Trek history because Gene Roddenberry steered his ship in an almost completely different direction. By 1987, Star Trek was beloved. Kirk, Spock, the Enterprise were all iconic.
But Gene thought it could be so much more.
He was so nice, friendly, charismatic, and open, and not at all what you would think a legend would be. Somebody who not only had a vision, but he proved his vision with the original show, and now we're trying to recreate that magic. So it was thrilling to be involved.
Back when Roddenberry was developing The Next Generation, he made a strong effort to keep it separate from the original series. And I think this was an audacious stance. I'm sure that most people who were involved in the production would say you need to give some familiarity to people.
Star Trek has an amazingly passionate audience and devoted fans, and they quite frankly loved the original series, and they didn't want any other version intruding on what they thought was Star Trek. So Next Generation went into rather rocky waters at the beginning.
It became apparent from the very beginning that Paramount was not going to let this thing get away from them. They had decided they were going to create a new business model for this show. Historically, our episodic was always produced through a network. Paramount came up with the idea, we are going to syndicate an hour episodic television show. We are going to control it. We're not going to have network involvement, which Gene always rued. I mean, the battles that he went through with NBC were legendary.
Paramount said, you don't have network people telling you what you can and can't do. Do a great show. September, they did a Star Trek 20th anniversary party. Half of Hollywood was there. You just knew there was a big announcement coming, right? October 10th, they finally announced it, that they were bringing Star Trek back. So I sent Gene a note, congratulations. So I get a call, come on down. So I come down and we're screening movies every day, science fiction films. So Gene can get back up to speed to see what the industry has been doing. And we would talk about things we'd like to see in the new Star Trek. Gene says, I want you to write the Bible. So I wrote the first draft of the Bible. Gene did a mild polish on it and then started handing out copies of it. I turned it in by David Gerrold for Gene Roddenberry, but it showed up as by Gene Roddenberry. Very odd.
There was a lot of turnaround in the writing staff. It was a quite charged time. Gene was certainly much more involved that first season, so you had his voice in the script.
I got my first script. They kept saying there was going to be a rewrite, there was going to be a rewrite. There wasn't one till the very last minute when Gene went through it and did the rewrite. He was all over it.
Gene had changed his worldview since the original series and was hard into the perfect future of Star Trek.
There was a lot of discussion about certain things. I know one was no internal conflict among the characters.
People without conflict aren't necessarily very interesting. That sometimes made it difficult to write for them.
In television, you are shooting the showrunner's vision, and good showrunners like Gene had a very specific thing in mind, and they tried to hire people who could execute it.
I think Next Gen was clearly indicating a kinder, gentler way of exploring the galaxy in Gene's mind. And there were families on board. I mean, it speaks to the hope of exploring the final frontier. In so many ways, the final frontier was about humanity. That's what Gene wanted.
Back before Next Generation came on, I was able to get a copy of the series Bible. And of course, in there, it had a couple drawings by Andy Probert of the new Enterprise and the bridge.
Andy Probert was the first designer on Star Trek The Next Generation. He created the Enterprise, he created the basic concept for the bridge, he set the visual tone of the show. Herman Zimmerman brought that to life, but without Andy's primal vision, Star Trek The Next Generation would have been something very different.
Working with Gene was not only an honor, but a privilege. Gene had some very specific things that he wanted in his universe. After working on the motion picture, I was always sort of bothered by the fact that as classic and as revolutionary as it was, those two warp engines were sitting way above the ship's center of gravity. And you'd think that it would actually make it do that rather than carry it along, you know. So I took those and I lowered it below the saucer, and I did this little picture just for my own self, and people think, well, that's the first thing that you ever did for the Next Generation. It's like, no, I didn't know there was going to be another. It was just for me. I took the round nacelles and I squished them into ovals, and I did the same with the engineering hull. And so I brought that into the Next Generation sketches. So I had these oval shapes, and I wanted to join them all together and create an organic version of the Enterprise. Organic shapes are inherently stronger than geometric shapes that are like welded or stuck together. How do I organically connect the saucer to a dorsal? And so I'm sitting in Gene's office And randomly, this electrician walks through the office. He was holding this piece of cable in his hand. And if you look at that and think of the saucer going into the back of the dorsal, it's like, oh my gosh, that could just flow right into the dorsal. So I was able to put that shape in there and make this organic ship. I started putting these up on the wall. One of the other people that was hired in that first group was David Gerrold. And then he noticed this drawing of the Enterprise, and he pulled it off the wall and he left the room. 15 minutes later, he walks back in and he takes that drawing and he puts it on my desk. Bam, that's what the Enterprise is going to look like. That has to be some kind of an insane record to get approvals on what the ship is going to look like. They wanted a long lead time in developing the bridge because that was their most important set. Gene wanted the screen to dominate the room, and he says, I don't want there to be a lot of people hunched over controls doing stuff. I want this to have fewer workstations because they could all be interchangeable, and I want everybody to be comfortable.
The Star Trek The Next Generation design ethic was something that Gene called technology unchained. Technology taken to the point where it serviced humans, so advanced, so attuned to the needs of the people on the ship that it becomes simpler. So I had to rethink everything that I wanted to do with the control panels, with the graphics. It was very difficult, but it turned out Gene was right. It helped give this new ship its own identity.
Herman Zimmerman, the production designer, had come on the show by then, who was so generous. He was pushing to get that look that none of the other shows had.
Andy Probert is a wonderful industrial designer. His creativity created this ship. His creativity gave us the ideas for the bridge. Andy's sketches are all curvilinear, very difficult to realize in feet and inches. When you're doing a TV series, especially a pilot, where the studio is breathing down your neck about how much money you're going to spend, you have to work as fast as you can, get the best people you can.
I created this tactical rail that goes around the command positions as a wooden structure. Nobody's ever seen wood on a command ship. Wouldn't that be cool?
I got one of the best set designers available, Les Gabrugi, was able to make sense of the railing. We got a fellow named Jim Wood to make that railing, a studio carpenter who found a way to literally sculpt that out of layers of glued together thin pieces of basswood that ended up being that beautiful arch behind Picard. It was just a whirlwind of activity. We were learning how to make it look like the future and be as believable as I think it turned out to be. I needed to get it there on time with the paint dry, ready to receive the actors and the camera.
When I first saw the set, my jaw dropped open because it was this big, beautiful bridge. The lights weren't on, and so while I was there, they had the lights turned on, and you see it sort of come to life, and that was sort of magical. Next Generation sets were lavish, but they were lit very brightly.
Everything was very bright and in your face, answering to Gene's request that the Enterprise was inviting and it was like a living room.
We were criticized for it, but I think he was right. Gene wanted it to be comfortable.
Gene wanted a lot of nature. He wanted a fish in the captain's office.
The lionfish was very small, but he looked quite large because he was in a spherical aquarium. We named the lionfish Livingston. I'm not quite sure he ever took that well.
Lionfish eat little baby goldfish. Herman Zimmerman objected to my putting limits on his creativity by telling him he couldn't build that big expensive set. He could build half that expensive set because that's all the money we had. And his backhanded compliment to me was to name this lionfish Livingston. And it was his way of saying, you're destroying my creativity. Herman, that's show business. When you're mounting something like this, everybody's working a little bit off of a fear factor because they want to make sure they don't mess it up. Everything has to be created from whole cloth.
The Enterprise was represented by a series of photographic miniatures. Originally, ILM built a 6-foot model and a 2-foot model.
They had to build physical models that they then had to photograph on a stage with what we call motion control, which allows you to duplicate the movement on the model from the camera over and over again so that you could do different passes on it. An arduous task. The process that they used on Next Generation was to take all these passes and combine them in various online editing rooms with greater or lesser success.
Eventually, Greg Jean built a smaller 4-foot model, which had just slightly enhanced surface detail. And what this meant was it was easier to light. And what that meant is that Star Trek The Next Generation can have a lot more new shots per episode. The Enterprise was an imaginary starship, but it was a real vehicle for storytelling. Aboard the Enterprise, we traveled into Gene Roddenberry's universe.
Gene was a marvelous visionary of what science fiction on television could be, what it should do. Gene inspired writers to write better scripts than they thought they were capable of. He'd say, tell me a story that no one else will let you tell. Tell me the story that sticks in your craw. The way things are is not the way they have to be. Tell me that story. Gene used to say this, and this is why I loved working with him for the longest time.
Gene's vision of a positive future for humanity certainly has had an impact on society. He shows us where we can go.
How to live a better life, help other people see what a better life might be. The greatest good for the greatest number.
You know, Star Trek is the world we wish we lived in. Gene was way ahead of his time.
We may not be there, but look at this. This is what we can aspire to. That's a pretty noble thing.
Gene's intent was to show the best face of the future of humanity. He wanted that to be a calling card for the new show.
Gene was driven by that passion to communicate that hope and optimism to a new generation.
We put in a lot of hours. The compensation is the opportunity to do the job and to see it on the screen. Something you can puff your chest out a little bit. I did that. I think we were just lucky. Just lucky.
It was such a nice place to come home to. I still see a lot of the people and talk to a lot of the people, but I miss being able to go to those stages, stand on those sets, and say action.
Gene started Star Trek The Next Generation trying to prove that he could do it again. And through 178 episodes and feature films, Gene proved that in fact he could.